So I produce a show called YOY, but that's not really what I'm going to talk about today. We launched in September. We were named the Best New Podcast of 2016 by the New York Times. It's going great. I'm part of Panoply. We have over 100 shows, about 50 staff members. Panoply is also a technology company. We built a publishing platform for podcasts. But before Panoply was born, before Serial existed, before the Times was doing the Daily, before Gimlet was born, I mean, going to, this is, God, like so long ago, May 2014, we created The Gist. I knew I wanted to work on The Gist with Mike Pesce when the Joe Romanesco blog posted his exit letter from NPR. And in it, he said that he's always wanted NPR to be a wee bit more ambitious or daring, willing to take risks outside of our comfort zone. And I could completely connect with that. I was excited to see what Mike Pesce would create. He's been a long-time NPR journalist. He was mostly like in the sports corner, but we knew he had a much larger range. So we had this question, like, what does a daily news show sound like in podcast form? Because up until that point, the only news you could get in podcasts would be like a weekly roundup kind of a show, or an NPR show that offered the full audio of the radio version kind of as a podcast. So it was fun to think podcasts first. So one of the things we did is we made up our own format. So an NPR show has an A, B, C, D segment, and we just kind of arbitrarily decided we would have a PQRS. And so the P would be like Pesce's thoughts on the news of the day. A Q would be a question answer, or sometimes we do something called a one question only, where we call up a journalist and ask them exactly one question, and obviously it turned into more sometimes. And then the R is, these are things we find interesting, and that'd be kind of an arts and culture interview. And we'd always end with the spiel, and like the spiel is the real joy of listening to The Gist. And this is one of my favorite spiels of all time, where he announced, and the spiel is usually just Mike Pesce's voice, which as a producer makes it incredibly easy for me that we're working just with this tool, which is his pacing, he'll throw to clips, we'll use music, we'll do sound design sometimes, but it's mostly his voice is about 75% of the show, and he has a real craft in how he uses it. So this is one of my favorite spiels. He announced that The Gist is a radio show, not a podcast. And you're like, what? I was listening to a podcast.
If this is radio, and it is, so what's that thing with the dial in the cars with all the static? That's over-the-air radio. Like we now refer to day baseball or acoustic guitars, we need to apply that retronym to over-the-air radio to distinguish it from this form of radio, which you get via devices, whenever you want, without static, rewindable, stop and startable, a little more niche, less traffic and weather on the 8s, playing less Iggy Azalea, talking for 25 minutes without having to take a break that you can't get out of. Isn't radio great?
So that's a little feel for his voice, and I do hope that catches on. I do hope we stop calling these podcasts someday.
If this is radio...
Oh, there we go. So the spiel is also very specific to Mike's experience as a longtime NPR reporter. This is when the spiel arrives in our inbox. In this case, it's at 3:39 p.m. with the goal of getting the show up by 5. It's just gibberish. It's very much out of Pesce's head, and then we work together to translate that into the show. But there's the spiel. It's like it really comes down to how he performs it. Something else we did that I'm proud of is that we gave the show tropes. So if you are a Gist completist, and there are tons of them, just like how people listen to the Daily every day, the Gist completists know that we always compare things to the size of Belgium, that every episode ends with the phrase "umpru, dupru, dupru," which means Peruvian turkey penis or something. Like, no one knows what it is. It's a top Quora cue. We also, like, a longtime producer trick is you have regular guests. So Maria Konnikova started doing a segment called Is That Bullshit, where we take apart kind of a scientific question. And then you can give your guests their own podcast. So Maria just came out with The Grift about con artists. And this is like not a new thing at all. I used to work with this 92-year-old host, Walt Bodine, at KCR in Kansas City, Missouri. And regular guests are a staple of daily news. This is like the oldest thing we know going way back. And he would have the food critics, he'd have the movie critics, he had the computer guys who would answer your computer questions, and they were all local celebrities. And I think about that now, like we have those podcast formats too. Like, how is that different from Pop Culture Happy Hour or something? So it's an old format that we're doing in a new way. Something else we do at The Gist that I'm really proud of is we let Pesce be vulnerable. So he'll often turn the day's headlines into a song. Like he'll turn it into like his own little Bruce Springsteen or Billy Joel. And we got so many complaints about his singing that I decided to get him a singing lesson.
Oh, nope.
What is it from there? You're going down, but it's up. Now,
Right?
you know when that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very podcast thing, right? It's like we're mostly caught up in the news, but sometimes we can take a break from the news and get him a singing lesson. And something else we do is we sometimes break from our own formula. So I think we did one week where we only interviewed other podcasters. You know, sometimes we'll totally ditch the QRS thing. Sometimes he'll be guest hosting Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, and he'll do the whole show from his hotel room, and while he's doing an ad for Harry's razor, he's actually shaving. So we felt freedom to experiment. And I've taken a lot of that with me as I do my own show now, Why Oh Why. Like I think everything I've learned about being a creative and innovative host has come from 8 years of working with other hosts and seeing how they do it. So I'll be working on this precious show, deep in the audio session, and I'll miss daily. I'll miss news. I'll miss the pace of working on a show like The Gist with Mike Pesce. And so now I'm thinking in terms of a news consumer. And I have this day that I think about a lot, which was the weekend after Trump's Access Hollywood comments happened. And it was Saturday, so that happened late afternoon on a Friday, right? Saturday morning at 11 a.m., the 538 podcast, I was listening, and they started talking about it right away. By 1:30, The Gist came out on a Saturday, which normally we're a weekday show. And Mike Pesce memorably compared Billy Bush to Chester the dog, and that kind of like goading on laughing. It was so funny, and it helped me understand the news that day. 1:30, the NPR Politics podcast came out. Then the next morning, on Sunday morning, I had a Trump cast, then Political Gabfest. None of these other shows used to be here for me. You know, when we started The Gist, I didn't have these voices and these friends to talk to the news about. And as a listener, I feel very served by that, and I'm really excited to see how we're going to innovate. And so this is my eagle wrapped in bacon. Pesce and I were once doing a live show, and it was like 20 minutes before the live show. He's like, Andrea, we need to add this. We need this in the presentation. I need an American eagle wrapped in bacon. And it was such a weird request, and you can't Google image search that, and I had to scramble. But I think a lot about how a daily news show lets you come up with that eagle wrapped in bacon, and I'm excited to see, like, it's a creative challenge every day, and I'm excited to see how other news organizations are going to innovate in this format, because podcasting is, if it's moving this quickly right now, I think we have a lot of places to go still. I think of it as a very young medium, and I think if we're all speeding up and we're all finding new ways to do news quicker in podcast form, we're going to find these eagles wrapped in bacon. Thank you.